So today's lecture is on advanced WPF concepts, and it's a teeny bit different than the lectures we've done in the past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run this example code that is on Canvas and just kind of take you through what each of these tabs is going to do. So each tab is going to be a slightly different lesson as far as these advanced WPF concepts go. There's first tab here, we're going to learn about simple binding and how this list box can be bound to the output or the content of other labels and text boxes. For instance, if I click blue, it's going to be bound to these labels. And you can see that the selected item of this list box, its item here is bound to the content of this label here, and it's also bound to the background color down here. So you can see if I do green, it's going to change to green. So that's what we're going to learn about on this first tab. The second tab, we're going to talk about how you can bind collections to, this is for instance, these lists. We're binding a list into these list boxes. And so we've done some things like this in Windows Forms. So I'm just going to show you how you can do it in WPF and some of the more advanced features that you can do in WPF about how you display data, where you don't just have to override the toString method like we had to do in Windows Forms. We have a little bit more flexibility. The next here is just working with data grids. Again, we've learned this in Windows Forms. Now we're going to apply this a little bit more to WPF. We're going to show you how this data grid is bound to a collection with the auto-generate columns to true. Then here's where we're manually setting the columns. This is the data grid where we're actually doing this row details template. So what that means is we've bound a collection to this data grid and it's displaying its data. However, for each row here, so each row is bound to an object in a list or a collection. And so within this object here, so this is a person object, this row 1, inside that person object is another collection of information about this person 1. So when I click this, this is another collection that is related, that is inside this other object. So you can set this what's called the row details template, and you can bind it to other information. So what I've done is I've bound this sub data grid to a collection that's contained within this other object. And so we'll go through how that's set up. And then this last one is talking about how the interface Inotify property changed. And so what this is doing is talking about, okay, it's fine. Let's say, you remember how we learned about the binding list before? Well, there's this thing called an observable collection in WPF. And so you fill that up and then you get that two-way binding that we've already learned about. So if you add or remove an object from this other collection, it automatically tells the user interface, for instance, delete this row. Okay, well, that's easy enough. However, what happens if you were to edit just a single value, a single property, for instance, job title property for a given object? Well, the UI does not have built-in communication, only at the actual object level. So when you add and remove objects, there's built-in communication between this data grid and your collection. However, if you update individual properties in that collection, they will not get reflected in the user interface. So if in the code I updated this object, this person for object, and I updated their years of the company to, let's say they've now been with the company 9 years, and I change that in the code, I set that property, it will not get reflected automatically right here in the user interface. What we have to do is actually raise an event that tells this data grid, hey, I've updated the data, you need to refresh that. And you do that by implementing what's called the Inotify property changed interface. So we'll go over that. So let's come back now and let's talk about simple binding. And so let's walk through it here and then we'll go through the code. And so you'll notice what I've done here is in WPF you can do what's called binding of elements. And you can bind properties of one element to the properties of other elements. So what I've chosen to do here is when you select an item in this list box, the selected item's content here, like for instance the text green, is bound to this label's content. So you can see that here. In this one, not only have I bound its content property, but I've also bound the background color. So you can see how it changes all the way through. And then we're going to talk about this last one that you can actually type in colors in just a minute. So you could have done this in code, right? This shouldn't have been too hard to say, on selected index change of this list box, go set this. But with the power of WPF, there's a lot of things that it can do right within XAML that you don't even have to do in code. So it can be kind of nice to write it just in your XAML. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So I'm going to kind of leave this open just enough so we can kind of see the different labels in the list box here. So let's just walk through the code. So you'll notice each of these are broken up into tab items. So I'm going to open up the first tab item, which is this simple binding. And let's just walk through it. So you can see I've just got a stack panel on here. Now within that, the main thing to look at is this list box. So I've got this list box called LB Color. So that's the name of this list box. Within that I have multiple list box items, and we can just see the only thing that's set is the content to the different colors within this list box. So now we have these different labels down here, and the idea is we want to bind the selected items text here to the content of these labels. And so here's the first way we can do that. That's with this code right here. And so here's our text block here, and this could be a label also. I chose to use a text block. They're really similar, other than text block gives you the ability to add in text wrapping, but it works just like a label. And so what I've done here is I've said, okay, the text blocks.text property, which is what these two tags do for you, I want to create this binding to another object. Now anytime you want to bind something, you have to use the binding class. Now remember, everything we're doing here you can do in code. So for instance, this statement right here is just saying text blocks, text block, my text block equals a new text block. That's all this statement does for you. So behind the scenes, it's actually writing that code. So just remember that this is instantiating a new text block, and this is just saying text block.width, set it to this, text block.height, set it to this, text block.font size, set it to this. This syntax here is saying, okay, text block.text, so this instantiated text block, its text property, I want you to bind it to this path and element name. So binding itself is actually an object. So you could say binding equals a new binding, sort of a thing. So this is just an object, or a class in C# that it's instantiating into an object for us. So this is the syntax for how you bind this text property to some other element's property. So first thing we do in our binding is we set up the element name. So you'll notice LB color, which it corresponds to this list box color. So we're saying, hey, our binding, that master object is this element name LB color. So we're pointing to this list box, and the path, the binding path, is selected item.content. So we're saying, okay, whichever item is selected here, so do selected item.content. So it's the same thing if, on our selected index change, we would get a handle to the currently selected list box item, and we say .content. So that's what you set up the path here. So there is something you could say LB color dot selected item dot color, or content, sorry. That's exactly what this path is saying here. So by just setting up this binding right here, anytime you select it here, there's a communication going back and forth that, hey, this got changed, therefore I'm also going to, because it's bound here, I'm going to change this label or this text block's content here, or its text property. So now another way to do the exact same thing. So this statement and this statement are exactly the same. However, this is the more common way to do it. It's kind of a shorthand notation, so you don't have to write out this full text block.text property. And so what you can do is you can just access the text like this. But now what you have to do is, rather than, because you're not actually specifying this syntax here where you're saying binding as a whole new element, because you're doing it inlined, you have to do this sort of special syntax here, where this sort of is a way of telling WPF you're going to instantiate an object that points to this text property, or you're binding to it. So this is kind of a linking way. So anytime you see this syntax, that's, some sort of binding or something's going on. And so just like here, we're instantiating this binding object, we're setting the path to the LBL color. We use a comma here, instead of the syntax here, and then path equals selected item.content. So that's why this one and this one are exactly the same when I select a different item up above. So now let's take a look at the next text block, where we're also going to set its background color. So you can see we've set the text exactly the same as we did above. And not only that, I've added on this mode equals one way. And so there's three different types of binding modes. There's one way to source, and two-way. So now one way is the default. And so what that means is that there's only a one-way flow of information. So that means the data flows from here, this list box, and it flows down to this label down here. So when this gets clicked, it communicates down to this label that it's bound to update it. And so you can see, in case you ever forget exactly what's going on, I've tried to put some comments on here on what exactly it does. So I've put here, like one-way binding, one-time binding, sends data from the source to the target. However, it does this only when the application is started or when the data context changes, and as a result does not listen for change notifications in the source. So it's just slightly different on this one time. It just means it's going to do it one time unless you explicitly tell it to bind again or update. And that's why the default's one way, because that's generally what you want. So unlike one way and one time binding, one way to source is the last way. Oh, sorry, there's one way to source and two way. One way to source binding sends data from the target to the source. And then finally, the two-way binding sends the source data to the target, and if there are changes in the target property values, those will be sent back to the source. So two-way binding says that this communication goes both ways. So what that means is, so normally the way this is working is that, it's going to come from here. This binding is going to come down to my target here. However, two-way, even if I update this text box right here, it's going to send those updates back up to here. They're bound both ways, and we'll look at that as just an example in a second. So, but for this text block, we're binding the text, and oh, by the way, we're actually binding the background color. So you can say we're saying binding name. We're doing, it looks very similar, where you set the element name as color and path to selected item dot content. But when we bind it to the background, this should actually be bound to a color. However, there is already code written for you, this conversion code that's going on behind the scenes that says, hey, you're passing me in a string, something like red, yellow, and it actually converts it to the appropriate color for you in the background. So there's this little conversion that's going on automatically for you in WPF. Now let's look at this last example down here. And so this is an example of two-way binding. So first the text of this last text box. Now we switch it to a text box, not this label text block. So we're using a text box now, and you can see the text is bound exactly the same, except for now we've changed the mode to two-way. And we've also bound the background color of this text box to the exact same way we've done it before. So there's just a one-way correspondence. So you select this color, it's going to set that to the background here. When you select the content here, it's going to change the text color. However, because this text is set up as two-way binding, whatever I text here in this, whatever I type in this text box here, it's actually going to be then populated back for whatever item is selected. So if I select red, red is going to appear down here. However, if I backspace over red and type black, then actually black, you'll see it being typed up here because of that two-way communication back and forth. Now what here, this update source trigger equals property changed, this is important on, hey, when you actually want this data sent back, communicated back up here. Now where it's property changed, what's going to happen is every time this text property changes, which means every time I every time I type some text into this text box, the property is changing. The text property is changing. So as I type, BLA, every time, every letter I type, it's sending that event. So it's raising that event and telling this, it's communicating up because of this source trigger set to property changed. And so here's the comments on how I've said the default value is lost focus. So if I were to left this, or either left it as the default or set this to lost focus, I could type all I wanted, but until I tabbed out of this control or clicked out of this control, that would be the time that it actually sent the event and actually raised that update source trigger event up to this. Then I've currently had it property change, so every time I type or delete, it updates it. And then the last one is this, you can set it to explicit, which then behind the scenes you actually have to say, hey, update it. And so it's just a way that you have to encode, send it to the target. So when I run this now, you'll notice as I click blue, sure enough, the background, the text here is set to blue. Here the text is set to blue, but so is the background color. And then this is exactly the same. However, what you're going to notice now is as I backspace, you can see it's actually backspacing up here. And because, BL is not valid anymore, it gets rid of that. Now let's type in, brown. So as soon as I type N, you can see it actually changes to brown. So it's kind of a goofy little example, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how you can bind different elements against it. So now let's go to the second example, which this up here, we've got a list box that's simply bound to a collection of person objects. And so we've seen this before when we dealt with combo boxes or list boxes in Windows Forms. And it's just like in Windows Forms in WPF, you overwrite the toString method. So each person object, we'll take a look at it, but each one has its toString overridden that actually prints out this message right here that says, shows the toString message for person 1, person 2, person 3. So that's all this is displaying. And so yes, I could have, just like I've done before, I could have concatenated first name and last name together, or employee ID and first name, whatever data I wanted to display here, but it's just plain text. And that's all we had in Windows Forms. However, in WPF, what we can actually do is not only is each of these rows bound to the exact same object up above. That's the other thing I want to point out is I have one collection that's bound to both of these list boxes, but you can see one of these, it's just looking at the toString property. The other one here, I've actually created what's called a data template. And so, yes, each row is bound to a person object in each row of that collection. However, I've also told this list box, hey list box, I'm going to give you a data template for how I want you to display that data. So that's what's kind of that power of WPF you hear me talking about, is that it allows you this flexibility to say, not only can you bind the object and not just override the toString, but you can tell it how you want that data presented. So you'll notice here what I've actually done is in this data template, and we'll look at just a second, I've created a label here that I've bound its text property to. You can see it says person, then it concatenates on this 1, 2, 3, right? So that's their name. Then what I've done is you can see I've actually had 2 rows here. So I think I put this in a data grid, and then I added a little space over here in my data grid. This is just a hard-coded label that says job title. Then I put a label on here and I bound it to a property that says job title inside of this particular object. So there's a person object, there's a property called job title, and that's what this label is bound to it. So it displays the data from that object here. Then same thing here. This is another bound property to job level. This is another property bound to years with the company. And so then what I do is I say, okay, I want to make this one blue. I can set the font. I can, again, make this tabbed over a little bit. And I can make it look however I want. I can put pictures in here. I can bind anything I want. But just notice how much, professional essentially this is, and it pops out the data rather than just a straight string here. And again, this is the part where a designer really comes in handy on how they can use colors and blend them together and draw the user's eye to the appropriate things. And again, I've kind of done this goofy, but I'm just trying to get the idea across to you that your imagination is the limit here on how you want to present this data. So let's take a look at how you actually set this up now. So let's close this down. I'm going to scroll back up here and close this tab item down. Let's open up the second one. So on this second tab now, let's take a look at the first list box here. You'll notice there's nothing special about it. It's called ListBox Incorrect. And then down below that, I've got this second list box here called ListBox Correct. So this is ListBox Incorrect and ListBox Correct. Now here is where I've bound it to a resource, the item template, to a resource called My ListBox Data Template. So this list box, I'm just binding the collection to it in the code, which we'll look at. And then I'm just letting, I overrode the toString property. So since I've bound it, it just looks at the toString property and displays the default way it knows how to display data. And this list box, I'm saying, okay, for each item, I'm going to give you its template, which is this My ListBox template, which I've defined up above. Now, to pass in an item template, you have to create what's called a static resource or a dynamic resource. Generally, you want to use static resources. And what the difference is that a static resource is static. It's never going to change. You create it, you bind it to this My ListBox data template, and this template is never going to change as your code is running. A dynamic resource is dynamic, where as your program is running, this My ListBox data template may actually be updated as the program's running. So maybe you allow the user to actually change this template. You've got special controls up here that allow the user to select font size and select colors of how this data should actually be displayed. So most of the time those static resources just fine. And again, remember, this is a class in C# that then points to this template. And then it gets bound to my item template. So let's go ahead and jump behind the scenes now and let's take a look at the code on how I do this. So the first thing that I want to point out is this observable collection. And so you always want to use an observable collection in WPF if you're binding to some UI element. You can bind a list, so this would be list, of a CLS person 1, which is fine, and it will bind just fine. However, you will never get those updates, those notifications back and forth. So if I were to add a new item to this list of people, it would never be displayed in the UI. So what you'd have to do is you would create a list of list people, fill up the list of people, bind it to that, this data grid view or the data grid on the UI here, and then from then on, any updates to this list would never be shown up in your user interface. So what you need to do is observable collection. That way, even after you bind this, there's that communication back and forth. So as you add and remove objects from this list of people 1, because it's an observable connection, this has built-in communication that it tells your UI element, whatever it's bound to, hey, I've been updated. You need to remove this row. You need to add this row at this position, etc., etc. So this is the first observable collection we're going to look at. So that means, hey, we need to know what CLS person 1 holds. So we scroll down here and you can notice we have multiple CLS person. We've got person 1, person 2, and person 3. So let's take a look at person 1 first. This is a very simple class setup. You can see I've just got name, job title, job level, number of years with the company. So I've got those properties all as strings, and I've also overridden the toString property. So here's that string that we just saw on our list box. And you notice all it does is it just prints this app message out and it concatenates on the name. And so that's what was getting shown up here. So it's just showing, hey, this is I don't have a template, so I'm just going to display this string that you're giving to me that you've overridden in the toString. So then in the constructor here, whoops, sorry, I meant where it's loaded, I instantiate that first person and I just fill it up with garbage data. That's all I'm doing here. And then down below here on this line here, you can see that list box incorrect. It's item source. I'm binding to that list of people, and I'm also doing that exact same thing to that other list box. So again, both those list boxes are bound to the exact same observable collection. So you can see that this one is just overriding toString, and this one actually has a template applied, but they're displaying the exact same data. It's just this is visually better because we're actually telling it how we want it displayed. Sometimes that matters, sometimes it doesn't. So, okay, well that's nice, but what is this, my list box data template? How did we actually do that? And so this item template is defined up above. Let me drop this down. So locally, if you want to create a resource, you have to put it inside this tag called window resources. Now this will make your resources local to your window, so they can't be seen application wide. So that's important. So only objects, UI elements within this window can see and use these resources. You would have to add it to your app.xaml file if you want it to be global throughout your application. But in this instance, we're just doing it locally. So what I've done is I've instantiated this object called data template, and I've given it a name or key called my listbox data template. And now inside of this, you can define anything you want visually. It doesn't matter. You can add list boxes in here, you can add data grids in here, you can add stack panels and text blocks and labels. Any way you want to display this data, you can do it. You can see what I've chosen to do is a grid, remember, that had those two rows, one column, and you can see my column width here, I'm saying take up everything. And then I've got 2 rows. So let's run this again. And so you can see here, I've got 2 rows of data, sure enough, and I've just got one big column, but I've got 2 rows of data. Then I said, okay, I'm going to have this text block here, and my first text block, what I want to do is I want it in the first row, in the first column, and all I'm going to do is bind the text to sname. Now, sname, if you remember, you come back here, here's the property that I'm binding to. So if we come up here, we can see that sname will be person 1, person 2, person 3. So I'm binding the text property. And then all I'm doing is I'm just making it pretty. I just set the font size, the font weight, and I make this one larger than I'm setting all the rest of that sub elements. So you can see, here's that first line, and I've made it bigger and bold. And now what I've done is I've added a stack panel, and I've just indented it a little bit to the right. And I've done that by saying, okay, first column, because there is only one column, and then go to the second row. And now here's my text block, and you can see that I've just moved it over left 10 over. Then I set this text block. Now this text block is just a label, right? There's nothing bound here. and that's this job title that we can see right here. So this just blank, this is just a hard-coded piece of text. Now the next element, this text block actually has something bound to it. And so its text property is bound to sJobTitle. So it's going to bind to this particular property of data. So it's saying, hey, display the job title in this text block, and this is how I want you to display it. And you can see I've said font size to 13, and this to blue. And then I do that for the job level. Here's a normal label, and then here's the bound text, etc., etc. And so this is how you set up the data template. But I just want to kind of impress on you that you can do anything you want in here. So you just have to be creative enough to figure out how you want to display the data. And again, this is where designers, come in handy because they understand how to present data to end users. So now let's go ahead and close this down, this Windows Resources. Open up our tab control. Let's open up the next tab item. And so in this one here, this data grid here, what we're going to do is we're going to bind some data to our data grid. And this first one we're going to leave auto generate columns to true, so it just creates the columns for us. And this bottom one, you can see we've actually created the columns of this data grid. So let's scroll down here now. So within here, you can see I've got this data grid up top here. I've said auto generate columns to true, and I've given it this name, default data grid. And you can see I've done nothing else with it other than bind data to it in my code behind the scenes. And then it decides how it's going to display that data. I haven't told it any binding or anything. I'm just going to bind the entire collection to it. So this other data grid, however, I've said, you know what? I actually want to create some data grid text columns here. And so if I'm going to create columns, and I set the auto generate columns to false, and this is DG custom columns. So you have to set this property called this collection property, datagrid.columns, and then for each data grid column, there's different types of columns, but this one just happens to be a text column. I set the headers here, and then I have to tell it, okay, this column is bound to this property in my collection. So up above it was doing that for me automatically, but here I'm actually saying I have to tell it which column is bound to which property. So let's take a look at that. So we come over here, we can see here's these two that we're working with. We notice both are bound to list people 2. So we come up here, here's list people 2, it's a person object, and so it's the exact same data that's bound to both those data grids. So we come up here and we take a look at it, and so you can see why this just automatically displays the properties as the headers, but again, you wouldn't want to display this as job title. You'd want to display it as job space title. So that's why we've created, that data for the end user. So now this one is that data grid details view where there's actually a collection within an object that we also want to bind to some more data. So let's take a look at how we do that. So if I scroll down here, open up this the second to last tab item. Here we've got a data grid. Now we know that for each object is actually going to have a collection inside that object. And you can see that other object holds, for instance, the work history of this particular employee. And so what we can do is first we'll create a data grid, and you can see we set it up just like we've done before. We say, okay, auto generate columns to false. Oh, here's all my columns and here's how I want them bound. So that's what we just looked at. But now there's inside of a data grid, there's a property called row details template. Okay, and so this is a template just like we did with the list box, except now we're going to say, hey, this details view, I'm going to give you the template for how I want you to display this data. Now I could have put this data template up above in the resources, but here I'm just going to put it right within this the data template property. And so again, I could do anything I want down here. I could display the data in text panels or another list box. I've chosen to say, okay, I'm going to create a grid here, and I kind of wanted to indent this other data grid over a little bit. So you'll notice, see how there's a space right here? So normally this would be butted right up against the left here, and so it'd be kind of confusing when you open this up. And so what I really wanted to do is have this opened up and then indent it over so it's clear that this piece of data is associated with this row. And then I've bound another data grid here. I could have bound a list box if I wanted to. I chose just to use another data grid. And so within this, I've created, again, a grid with 2 columns. And this is what gives me that little space over from the left. Then I just put another data grid in it. And I'm saying I'm going to bind my item source to this collection that's within this object, and that's called companies. And we'll look at that in just a second. Now within that collection, there are objects, and so here's the properties from that object. So company name, contact, and phone. So let's look at the code now. And so if we scroll down, here's this details row, and we can see it's bound to list people 3. And so that's actually a person 2 object. You can see the data is also filled up here. So if we come down here and take a look at person 2 now, then we open this up, what you can see is, yes, we've got name, job title, job level, number of years with the company. So this is exactly the same. However, within this class, you can see we actually have a list of this company class, which is right here. This also has 3 properties: company name, contact, and phone. So think about yourself. How many different jobs have you had? Have you only had one job? No, you might have had 2 jobs or 20 jobs, whatever it is. So you're going to need some sort of collection, right? You need to have a list that can hold all of your jobs. So a single person has many jobs associated with them. And so in this instance, here there's many companies that this person has worked for. So here's the person, and here's the list of all the companies that they've worked for. So we create this collection, this company collection. Okay, this is what the company is made up of. And now what you'll notice is I've got this public property called companies that just gets and sets this list here. And then in the constructor, just to make it easy, I've just added some hard-coded some companies in here. So each person's going to have the same companies, but I just used it as an example. So if we come back over here, walk through this one more time, you can see my master data grid is bound to that list or that observable collection and these properties. That'll set up all my columns here. Then inside this details row, I create another data grid, and that data grid is bound to the company's property inside this right here, this company's property inside this person object. So I want to display all the companies that this person has worked for. And then each of those columns are bound to the properties down here, company name, contact, and phone within that company object. And you can see that's what they're set right here. So that's how you can do the details view. So the last tab here is this Inotify property change, and this is a very, very important concept to kind of get your head around and really understand. And it's just the idea that this is an observable collection, has lots of functionality built in, which is great. So when you add and remove objects from that collection, it automatically gets reflected in the UI. However, if you update an individual property of one of those objects, it will not be reflected in the UI. You have to manually tell this UI ListBox or data grid, whatever it's bound to, you have to tell it, hey, this property got updated, you need to reflect that update. So what you'll see here is I've got this data grid, auto-generate columns to false. I've set the columns just like we've seen before. I've bound each one to this particular employee object. So this looks exactly the same. This is DG Inotify, this data grid. So if we scroll up here, we can see here's this DG Notify, and you can see we've bound it to this person 4, which is also of type, so this is of type person 3. So now we need to understand what's in this person 3, because this is where that Inotify property changed. So this is where we actually have to write in some code. So again, if you want to have individual properties be updated, you have to do that in each property. You have to reflect that. So here we've got private attributes, name, job title, job level, and number of years with the company. We've seen this before. And what you're going to notice here is now I've got a property for each of those attributes, just like we should do. Now here's the extra code. This class implements Inotify property changed. Now remember, if you always just think of an interface as a contract with the compiler, you'll be just fine. So what does this contract mean? If I do go to definition, the only thing I have to do in my code is define an event that's of type property changed event handler, this delegate, property changed. So I have to have this event with this delegate defined in my code. So I have to be able to raise this event from with my code. And so here, sure enough, this is how I've implemented this Inotify property changed. I've just declared this event in my code. And this is the event that I have to raise every time a property gets updated. So we've done something just like this before. If you remember from that like airline type example where they clicked on different seats, I created my own event called like seat click, and I created my own delegate Then I raised that event every time they clicked on a seat. Well, I'm doing that same thing here. So let's take a look. Now, if you get the property, we're just doing it just normal. There's no extra code here. Now the set, however, you'll notice I set the value of my property just like I normally would. Then I say, okay, if my property change does not equal null, so if this is actually set to something, then here's where I raise that event and I say this is the object that is changing. So I just say this. Then I have to, you'll notice that when I do property changed, you can see who's the sender. This object is the sender. And now you need a way of communicating to whatever item you're bound to, which UI element, which property got changed, and so therefore it needs to be reflected in the user interface. So you say new property changed event args, and you can see it even tells you to instantiate that right here. Then you pass in the name of the property that just got updated. So what this statement does is it just says, hey UI, whoever I'm bound to, my UI element that I'm bound to, just so you know, the name property got updated, so you need to reflect that change. That's what this statement does. Now you notice in job title, if we look at its set property, it's exactly the same. Now I set the job title to value, but in its property change, you can see I set it to job title. So that's the difference there. So when I run my code, when we come over here, you can see I update the data with update the data grid with new data. And when I did that, you can see that it actually got reflected here in my code. And so if we go behind the scenes now, we take a look at that button click, you can see all I was doing was updating these properties within my data grid, or sorry, within my observable collection, which then raised that property. And so let's go ahead and set a breakpoint here, and let's just walk through this. I click here. Okay, now if I press, let's say I set a breakpoint here, and it's going to first call name. So let's come into name and set a breakpoint here, hit F5, and so it's now going to set this up. I press F10. F10, now it communicates to whatever element I'm bound to, hey, you need to reflect this change in the name property. So now when I hit F5, sure enough, the name got updated. So that's Inotify property changed. And hopefully these WPF advanced concepts help you create a more professional, looking user interface.